Welcome to this session on the 21st of November, and we are going to be learning about the life of Lilian Ala'i from one of her 6 grandchildren. That's Haylee Ala'i, and she has been assisted in this by Lillian's daughter, Sitere. And so we welcome Haylee and her husband, who are going to start with an opening devotion, and then we'll look forward to the presentation.
Should they attempt to conceal its light on the continent, it will assuredly rear its head in the midmost heart of the ocean, and raising its voice proclaim, I am the life giver of the world. I am the life giver of the world. Should they attempt to conceal its light on the continent, it will assuredly rear its head in the midmost part of the ocean, raising its voice proclaim, I am the life giver of the world. I am the life giver of the world. Should they attempt to conceal its light on the continent,
Well, welcome, Haylee. It's over to you. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience during all of that. So tonight, as Graham mentioned, I've prepared a presentation about my grandmother, Lilian Elizabeth Wyss Ala'i, who is the Knight of Baha'u'llah to the Samoan Islands. And Lillian's always been a great source of inspiration to me, particularly as a young Australian woman myself. I have always reflected on her story a lot in my own life, and drawn on it as I've made decisions about service and how I go about my day-to-day life. So I especially wanted to thank my auntie Sitere, who's Lillian's daughter, who's here tonight, as she did a lot of research and compiled a lot of information in order to get this together. And she also did fact checking after I'd written everything up. Sitere also will be the one, if you have any questions tonight, then hopefully Sitere can answer, as she was alive during most of the period of this presentation that you'll be hearing about, whereas I've just come at the end of Lillian's story. So, and also I'm aware there are many friends here tonight who would have also been around during many of the decades that we'll be talking about, and who might have had firsthand experience of some of these events. So I'm really just sharing things that I've heard from other people and from Grandma herself. Yeah. So right now, Lillian is actually living in the Gold Coast in Queensland, Australia. In 2010, she moved to Australia to live with her daughter Sitere and receive care from her, and also support from Sitere's husband Ruhi, who was moving back and forth from Indonesia. And so she's quite elderly now, and she's not with us tonight, but maybe we can all think of her in our prayers this evening. So I'll just share the PowerPoint now, so you can all see and follow along. share. There we go. There we are. So we'll start off with a little bit about her early childhood. So Lillian was born in Paddington, Sydney, in Australia on 2nd July 1929, and she was the second child of Swiss parents Frank Wyss and Marie Schluep, who had separately emigrated to Australia in 1925 and met and married in Sydney in 1927. And Lillian's only sibling was Frank, who was born 2 years earlier than her in 1927. Her early life was spent in Sydney, where she and her parents and Frank lived at a little house in Rosebery, Sydney. She was born in the year the Great Depression started. And during that time, as many of you are aware, Australia suffered years of high unemployment, poverty, low profits, deflation, and there was also a lot of civil unrest in Sydney. Although life was difficult, friends were made at the Swiss Club of New South Wales. And in Lillian's mother's photo album, she has pictures of the family sightseeing, as well as picnics with friends at parks, attending weddings, zoo visits, and swimming. So I think a fairly typical life maybe for someone young at that time. This is their family there. In 1939, at the age of 10, her family moved to the rural town of Tarmore in the Macarthur region of New South Wales. And her parents purchased 10 acres of land and developed a poultry farm. And the Swiss cottage was to remain a homecoming haven for the years that followed Lillian's service to the faith. She completed primary school at Tarmore Public School. So the junior youth years, as the Baha'i community is well aware, is a very special period. It's the years immediately before the age of 15, the period of maturity. And these are significant as certain powers of the heart and mind become available to a young person. And unsurprisingly for Lillian, this was also a very significant time, as it was when she started to learn about the Baha'i faith and investigate the faith and become confirmed in the faith herself. So she was a very service-oriented and thoughtful junior youth, and her parents had originally been Catholic. However, they had become what you might call free thinkers. And although they insisted Lillian and Frank go to church, they didn't mind what religion Lillian and Frank wanted to be. So by the time Lillian was 13 or 14, she was already teaching Sunday school at the Presbyterian Church on Sunday mornings and at the Methodist Church on Sunday afternoons. And being a Christian, she of course attended Christian classes at school, and the class that she attended was the Church of England class. And recalling that, Lillian said that it was the biggest class at school, which meant that all the kids could do their homework and not be noticed. But during confirmation studies, she listened attentively. And in a question-answer period that was held by the minister, she asked a lot of questions, questions concerning heaven and hell and attitudes to non-Christians. And these were pretty vital questions, obviously, to her development and perception of life, especially at that time, which was overshadowed by the gloom of World War II. And there was acute suffering that was quite evident to her and the rest of humanity. In recounting that session, Lillian said that at the end, the minister asked if anyone had any questions, and Lillian got up and said, "Yes, I do." And she told him that she had been asking these questions all along, and he hadn't given her an answer, and for that reason, she didn't want to be confirmed. So during these years in high school at Baha'u'llah High, Lillian and her brother Frank first heard about the Baha'i faith through their school friends, Antoinette, Mariette, and Stanley Bolton. Their parents owned a private property at Yaranville known as Bolton Place, which is now known by many of us as the Yaranville Baha'i Centre of Learning. So all together, these students were weekly boarders at Bowral High School and traveled together on the train on Sunday night to Bowral and on Friday afternoons back home for the weekend. And as friendship blossomed, discussions about the faith came up, and often on weekends, Lillian and Frank would go to the Boltons' house in Yarranball and sometimes stay for Easter breaks. So this friendship and the obvious effects of the war prompted Lillian to have a closer study of the faith, and also her brother, Frank, too. So during those early years, as many of you will know, before someone became a Baha'i, they were required to study things like Baha'u'llah and the New Era and the Will and Testament of Abdul-Baha. However, it was gleanings of the writings of Baha'u'llah that really confirmed Lillian's belief in Baha'u'llah. So finally, when Lillian and Frank decided that they wished to be Baha'is, their parents asked them whether their desire came from simply wanting to be like their friends or whether they really believed in the faith. And of course, Lillian and Frank really felt sure that they believed. And so their parents accepted their wish to be Baha'is. And 1 month before Lillian turned 15, on 5th of June, 1944, she declared at the Yarranball Winter School at Bolton Place. And her 16-year-old brother, Frank, declared at the same winter school on 29th of May, 1944. 6 months later, their mother, Marie, also became a Baha'i, and she was also a member of the first local spiritual assembly of Yarranball in 1948. Their father, however, never became a Baha'i, but he was an active supporter of the Baha'is. Something quite interesting that we found as we were going through Lillian's records was a letter from the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Australia and New Zealand at that time, that's what it was, addressed to Mrs. Bolton. And in that letter was enclosed a letter to Lillian and Frank acknowledging their declaration. And so I thought to share a little bit from that letter. In the letter, the National Assembly notes some of the aspects of what it means to declare one's faith in Baha'u'llah, and also drew attention to the role of Baha'i youth. So one little excerpt from that is where the National Assembly said, "What hope is there for mankind if youth such as you are not prepared to take a stand? Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, in his letter to the American Baha'is and the Baha'is throughout the world, entitled The Advent of Divine Justice on page 25, calls on the American Baha'i youth and the Baha'i youth of all lands to do their part in establishing a new civilization. The National Assembly knows that you too, like hundreds of other young Baha'is throughout the world, will accept the Guardian's challenge to help usher in the new day." So this last part about accepting the Guardian's challenge to help usher in the new day really stood out to me, because it seems like throughout all of Lillian's life, from these earliest years, she was ever ready to respond to the Guardian's call. And incredibly, Mrs. Bolton also received a letter on behalf of the Guardian acknowledging Lillian and Frank's declaration. So I have a little excerpt of that here where it says, "He was also very pleased to see that the sessions of the Yarranball School had been so successful, and that two such enlightened youth as Lillian and Frank Wyss had expressed their intention of joining the faith. Please extend to these two young people a hearty welcome into the cause on behalf of Shoghi Effendi." So an episode from this period that particularly touched my heart, because I think it shows a little of the capacity and qualities of young people, was when Lillian and Frank and the Bolton children and another Baha'i from nearby decided that they should be able to have their own Baha'i studies class at school, while the other children went to Christian class. So they approached the headmaster and explained to him that as they were Baha'is, they felt they should have this class. And after looking at the Baha'i books that they had given him, the headmaster allowed them to have their own study group once a week. So this perhaps was maybe one of the first Baha'i studies groups in a high school in the state of New South Wales, and maybe one of the earliest ones in Australia. And it's also worth mentioning that 3 of the 5 youth in this studies group became Knights of Baha'u'llah, and 2 of the group were also school captains. So a very capable bunch of young people. While Lillian was studying in Baha'u'llah, and continued to advance through her teenage years. Her faith was deepened, particularly through the support of two believers from Adelaide, Maisie and Percy Almond. In her final years of high school, she was a prefect, selected by staff and students. She was awarded Dux of Economics and also received awards in hockey and tennis. And she was granted a leaving certificate for studying English, maths, chemistry, French, modern history, and economics. And she also received a very commendable letter of reference from the headmaster of the school, which we found in her records. After high school, she undertook secretarial studies in the Metropolitan Secretarial College in Macquarie Place, Sydney. And she travelled from Tamworth into Sydney by train every day. In November 1947, she was awarded a diploma in secretarial practice and was a near straight A student. She was also awarded a certificate for Summerhays shorthand, 90 words per minute, a certificate of proficiency in bookkeeping with distinction, and a first-class certificate in business knowledge postal service. And these skills really served her well, not only in her time to come in Europe, but also in securing work in Samoa and through the rest of her life. So, as some of you may not know, she spent a number of years in Europe. As Lillian's parents had never returned to Switzerland, they were eager to send Lillian so that she could learn about her Swiss heritage and meet her relatives. So on November 8th, 1947, Lillian left Sydney for Europe, sailing on the RMS Orion ocean liner, which departed from Woolloomooloo Wharf. And farewelling the passengers were a crowd of 4,000 people, including Lillian's parents and friends from Tamworth and Sydney. The ship's final destination was England, and eventually she arrived in Baden, Switzerland, where her grandmother and uncle lived. And because she was Swiss, she was able to obtain work for some 2 years as an English shorthand typist in an engineering firm that her uncle worked for. During her years in Europe, she traveled to a number of countries, spending time with her Swiss family and Baha'is all throughout the continent. She went to Switzerland, Belgium, Netherlands, Rome, Florence, Italy, Norway, Germany, France, and Britain. During her time in Europe, she attended many Baha'i conferences and gatherings and met many prominent Baha'is, including Hands of the Cause, Amelia Collins, Dr. Ugo Giaccari and Herman Grossman, and Zekrullah Khadem. And no doubt these encounters served to really deepen her faith and her desire to respond to the needs of the hour. And as you can see in this picture, she kept a really well-organized photo album. So everything's neatly labeled and beautifully put together. Here's another photo of her at a teaching conference. So her time in Europe fell a few years after the end of World War II. And at this time, the Guardian had given a great responsibility to the American believers to help to re-establish the faith in Europe after all the destruction. And so as Lillian became aware of this, she was impelled to offer herself as a pioneer. And when the American Teaching Committee responded to her that she wasn't American and so she should ask the permission of the Guardian, she did just that, and she wrote to Shoghi Effendi. And of course, the Guardian responded saying that, of course, she was more than welcome to offer herself as a pioneer and that it didn't matter where she was from. So at the request of the committee, she went to Norway and supported herself by working as a maid/nanny in a household, which secured her accommodation. At that time, there was very little food, and she recalled that most people subsisted on whale meat and potatoes for months on end. At the end of 1950, she returned to Switzerland, though this time to Zurich, where she worked in an engineering company as a correspondent for foreign languages until October 1955. So also during her time in Europe, Lillian became good friends with a number of Baha'i youth around the continent. And towards the end of 1952, learning of the needs of the faith in Africa and that it was part of Great Britain's plan to help open Africa to the faith, she and some of her friends decided that they wanted to help. This was, of course, before the countries in Africa were part of the 10-year crusade. So without telling one another, they all wrote to the Guardian separately and all received responses back. And in a letter written to Lillian on the Guardian's behalf on 4th of June, 1952, he instructed her to return to Australia and render pioneer service there in order to enable your own country not to fail in its plan. Now, this mission from the Guardian was quite a task because it was already the end of 1952 and the plan ended in March 1953. And at this stage, although Lillian had spent some years in Europe, she hadn't had the chance yet to visit the Holy Land. But receiving this letter from the Guardian, she put this desire aside and thought that she should probably go back to Australia immediately in order to carry out the Guardian's wishes. So she tried to find a boat back to Australia without much luck and thought that maybe she should head to Great Britain and perhaps offer herself to serve at the National Office there while she waited for a ship. The National Assembly, however, decided that the best way for her to serve would be as a travel teacher throughout the country. So she did just that. And one day during these teaching trips, while passing through London on her way to another town, she went to the shipping company and joined the queue, just to see whether there happened to be any ships back to Australia. When she got to the desk, she found out that the person just ahead of her had cancelled their ticket and that she could get on a ship tomorrow. So Lillian immediately informed the National Assembly that she was unable to continue the teaching trip, and she left on 5th of November, 1952 on the Strathendon ocean liner. So Lillian arrived back in Sydney on 11th of December, 1952, and by this time there were some 3 to 4 months left of the plan. She thought that she would be heading back to Australia to fulfill a pioneering goal. However, the National Assembly decided that it would be best to send her on a travel teaching trip around several states of Australia. Her travels took her to many of the difficult areas in several states of Australia, in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and Tasmania. At that time, I think there were handfuls of Baha'is in Australia, with probably no more than 15 to 20 Baha'i youth in the whole country. Often, she was asked by the Baha'is why she had returned to Australia, and her only reply was that the Guardian had told her to. Somehow, through a mighty effort of all the Australian believers, by March 1953, all the goals were achieved. To gain a glimpse of the value of Lillian's contribution during her years in Europe and in Australia, I wanted to share an excerpt from an article that was published in the Australia and New Zealand Baha'i Bulletin in 1952, announcing her return from Europe. So the article says, "We are happy to be able to announce that our beloved Guardian has directed Lillian Wyss to return to Australia to assist us in the critical last weeks of our plan. We are deeply grateful for this bounty. Lillian wrote to the Guardian and offered her services in any field, and the Guardian has lovingly directed her to return to Australia and New Zealand to assist us in our plan. Lillian sails from England on the Strathendon on 5th November and arrives in Sydney on 11th December. The ship usually makes stay of a few hours in Fremantle, Adelaide, and Melbourne, and so the friends in those states will have an opportunity of seeing Lillian then. It is planned that she will visit each state again later. The European Teaching Committee wrote to say that her departure from Europe will be felt by the whole of the 10 goal countries. Friends in Australia and New Zealand will be richly blessed to have her with them once again." So after travel teaching, she assisted the National Baha'i Office in Paddington, and at Rezvan 1953, at the age of 23, she was elected to the National Spiritual Assembly of Australia and New Zealand. Interestingly, her old schoolmate, Stanley Bolton, was also elected in the same year. So not long after she was elected to the National Assembly, word came of the announcement of the 10-year crusade. Lillian was with her parents at the family home farm and received a telephone call from the secretary of the National Assembly at that time, Greta Lamprell. The National Assembly had just received a long cable from The Guardian, and so Greta called Lillian to tell her what it said. Some 131 countries were to be open to the faith in a 1-year period. That's amazing. And after finishing reading the cable, Greta asked Lillian, "What's your answer?" And Lillian said to her straight away, "You send him, The Guardian, a cable and tell him I will go." After she said this, she hung up and looked up at her mum, who had been in the kitchen with her while she was on the phone. Her mum, thinking about how Lillian had just come back from being away for 5 years in Europe, said to Lillian, "You're leaving again, aren't you?" And Lillian responded, "Yes." Later, her brother Frank, in response to this same message, opened the Cocos Islands in the Indian Ocean. And it's quite a rare event that both children of one family should become Knights of Baha'u'llah. In recalling this incident in an interview with Don Blanks, Lillian said that after the call, all she was thinking was that of course she would go, and that if the beloved guardian asked you to go, then you go. Instant, complete, and exact obedience was required. And although the guardian had made a statement about Knights of Baha'u'llah, Lillian mentioned that no one ever thought that they would be Knights of Baha'u'llah. She said that she had thought of it more like when you read the writings and read something like Heroes of God, that it was just a statement that was being made. I also wanted to take this moment to highlight something that Lillian mentioned in a talk that she gave in the Gold Coast. In this talk, she reminded the friends about the important role that youth have always played in the advancement of the faith since the days of the Dawnbreakers. And in thinking about youth fulfilling this role, she drew the attention to the role of parents. And she mentioned her eternal gratitude to her parents for permitting her to pioneer in Europe and then to the Samoan Islands, and that she remembered them for this every day in her prayers. So in Australia and New Zealand, when the friends learned of the goals of the Pacific Islands, they were all rather stunned. And at that time, the Pacific was like a vast, unknown black space. They had no idea how one got to any of the islands or anything like that. So the National Assembly set up a committee, and Lillian and Margaret Rowling were given the job of putting together a manual to cover the islands of the Pacific that were mentioned, with information about how to get there, climate, currency, how to enter. As Lillian considered where to go, and after looking at all the goals in the Pacific, she saw that Iran only had one goal, the Solomon Islands. As she knew that there was no way an Iranian would ever get into the Solomon Islands, she decided to go there. In a letter written on behalf of The Guardian to her in 19 July 1953, he affirmed her desire to pioneer despite her service on the National Assembly, saying, "In spite of your activities there in the teaching and administrative fields, he considers pioneer work far more urgent at present. No matter how much the friends wish to go out as a pioneer, it is not possible for more than a few of them to actually do so. And so those who are willing to should arise with no loss of time and go forth, and be inscribed on the roll of honor. He therefore urges you to make plans to proceed to a virgin post, preferably in the Pacific Islands, as soon as possible. He will pray that you will be richly blessed in that glorious undertaking." And at the bottom, in the Guardian's own words, "May the beloved enable you to promote at all times and under all circumstances the vital interests of this faith and its nascent institutions." So as we know, Lillian didn't end up being the Knight of Baha'u'llah to the Solomon Islands. So arrangements were made for her for the Solomon Islands, a visa and a job secured with the government. And the National Assembly of Australia and New Zealand was so excited that they decided that Lillian should have publicity about this in the newspaper. Other soon-to-be Knights of Baha'u'llah, Dulcie Dive and Alvin and Gertrude Blum, who were members of the National Assembly, assured Lillian that if there were any issues with the publicity, that they would go in her stead. So there was a write-up in the Sydney Morning Herald with a photo and everything, and the next day Lillian's job was cancelled. Therefore, Alvin and Gertrude Blum fulfilled their pledge and became Knights of Baha'u'llah for the Solomon Islands. And years later, actually, Alvin told Lillian that he felt had she gone to the Solomon Islands, there would have been no way that she could have taught the faith, because all the unmarried women had to be kept in a compound by themselves and had no contact with the Solomon Islanders. So she was lucky about that. So following this incident, the Canadian National Assembly had written to Australia sharing that they couldn't find anyone to go to the Samoan Islands, and they requested assistance. So Lillian decided to go there on behalf of the Canadian Friends. And since that time, Lillian said that the Canadians always considered her a Canadian, and they sent her copies of the Canadian Baha'i News. I also wanted to mention that Lillian was one of 6 of the 9 members of the National Assembly of Australia and New Zealand who resigned from the Assembly and went pioneering during the 10-year crusade. The others were Stanley Bolton to Tonga, Dulcie Dive to the Cook Islands, Alvin and Gertrude Blum to the Solomon Islands, and Greta Lamprill to Tahiti. And they were all named Knights of Baha'u'llah. And the 3 remaining members of the National Assembly, when able to, financially supported pioneers to get out into the pioneering field. In a letter on behalf of the Guardian to the National Assembly, he recognized this achievement of the National Assembly, saying that particularly gratifying and indeed inspiring has been the response of the members of your assembly to the call for pioneers, a response that has surpassed that of any other national body throughout the Baha'i world. I think that's a wonderful achievement for Australia and New Zealand. I thought I would also mention a few occurrences that happened before Lillian arrived in Samoa to do with the faith there. So the first one goes back to the time of the tablets of the Divine Plan, when Mother and Father Dunn were en route to Australia. They actually stopped in American Samoa, and there they raised the call of Ya Baha'u'llah Pa. And no doubt this first seed of the faith began to germinate and prepare itself for a great spiritual destiny. Also, shortly before Lillian arrived in Western Samoa, an individual, Mr. Emmanuel Rock, had learned of the faith from Alvin Blum and from Lillian's future husband, Haylee Ala'i. And after going to Samoa for a government job, Emmanuel decided that he wanted to become a Baha'i. So he was technically the first Baha'i there, but unfortunately, Emmanuel didn't remain a Baha'i. However, it was through Lillian's contact with him that she was able to obtain enough information to get into Samoa. In December 1953, she flew out of Rose Bay, Sydney, on a seaplane, which landed in Mechanics Bay, Auckland, New Zealand. And there she spent time looking for a ship that would take her to Samoa. And during this time, she also attended Baha'i summer school, where she met her husband, Sohail. Sohail was a Persian overseas student at Massey Agricultural College in Palmerston North, and he happened to be the second Persian Baha'i in New Zealand. So eventually Lillian was able to depart Auckland on the Matua vessel. It took 2 weeks to reach Samoa, traveling through Fiji, Tonga, Niue, and Lillian recalled that it was a lot of fun traveling this route. When passing through Fiji, she met with the local spiritual assembly there that had formed in Suva, and she also came across Elena Marcella and Roy Fernie, who were from Panama and who were en route to the Gilbert and Ellis Islands, Kiribati and Tuvalu. She arrived in Western Samoa on the 14th of January, 1954. When the Matua pulled into Apia, a lush tropical environment with thousands of coconut trees and scattering tinned roof abodes met Lillian's eyes, a total contrast to her 5 years in Europe. And looking over what seemed to be an ocean of green, Lillian's first thought was, "Oh, Baha'u'llah, where will I find the people?" In the early 1950s, life was, of course, very different to today. If you arrived by ship in Apia, you were rowed ashore. Wherever you went in Samoa, there were outrigger canoes lined up on the shoreline, and there was a partially sealed road that led to Apia, and at night people often sat on the road and played their ukuleles and sang. There were a few import-export businesses and some trading stores, very little electricity, mainly just in Apia, and most of the homes were Samoan fales, as you can see in this picture. I thought I might just take a few minutes to pause here and maybe see if anyone had any comments or anecdotes to share about this first kind of period in Australia and Europe and heading to Samoa, or the call of the 10-year crusade. We can maybe take a couple minutes. Anyone to please feel free to share. Otherwise, we can also move on.
Thank you, Haylee. I note that we do have members of Lillian's family online. And we also have one of her other contemporaries, Rodney Hancock's online, who was one of the pioneers to Papua New Guinea at exactly the same time. He will have known Lillian as well. So if anybody wants to take up Haylee's invitation there to add a comment about this early period of Lillian's life, this is a wonderful time to do so.
Yeah. Graham, I'd like to say something. Am I getting through?
Yes, Margaret, go ahead,
yes,
please.
Because I first met Lillian in 1952 when I'd been pioneering in the 6-year plan, and I was staying at the Wyss household because Frank was the first Baha'i I ever met. My husband introduced him to him. So
Margaret, I think you should introduce yourself, and Haylee, if
I'm sorry.
to unshare the screen. And this is Margaret Blewett speaking.
Yes, I'm Margaret Blewett. Yes, I became a Baha'i when I was 18 in 1951, and the first person I met as a Baha'i before that was Frank, and so I stayed at the farm in Tamor, and from then on, Frank was our biggest supporter while we were pioneering in Leeton, which was a gold town for the 6-year plan. So after that, of course, Lillian went to Samoa, and I remember when her picture came in the Solomon, that she was going to the Solomons, and then she couldn't go. But after that, she went to Samoa, and we stayed in Australia until 1964 when we went pioneering to Papua New Guinea. But in the meantime, my husband was on the NSA for quite a few years. So I was involved from then on very much with all the things that Lillian spoke of. So wonderful to meet her granddaughter because we were kind of contemporaries, having babies at the same time, and she was in Samoa and I was in New Guinea, and yes, and Australia, because whenever she came back, I remember the conference in '67 when she came back wearing her Samoan costume, and I was there with a Papua New Guinea child. That was the last time I saw her when she was younger, but I did see her later when I was staying with Frank in Canberra, and we had a good chat, and I met Siddhartha for the first time. Then I went on to do a doctorate on the Persian Baha'is and their adaptation to Australia. So yes, I can ride that road with Lillian. Thank you, Haylee. I'm very happy to watch you doing PowerPoint because now I know how I could possibly do it. Okay.
Thanks very much for that, Margaret. Anybody else want to take that? Maybe someone else from the Ala'i family. I think we've got some in New Zealand who are online. Well, we can come back to that. Mr. Rodney Hancock, do you want to say anything about Lilian Ala'i at this point? Haylee, I think you can keep going.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you, Margaret. So nice to hear from you and to meet you. So I will continue. Where were we? So the early days of Lillian's time in Samoa. So when Lillian arrived in Western Samoa, she was met by Emmanuel Rock, who I mentioned earlier, and she stayed in the same boarding house that he stayed in. And the next day she went down into town and got a job as a private secretary for Mr. Ted Annandale. And he was the general manager of an import-export firm. So the job didn't pay her much, but it was just enough to keep her alive. And she had no idea at the time, but Ted and many of the employees who took very good care of her and taught her the essentials of Samoan custom, a lot of them came from prominent Samoan families. So she had wonderful connections in the community there. And beautiful example of their kindness was that when she and her colleagues would attend a special party, they would always make sure that Lillian had a non-alcoholic drink that looked the same color as what everyone else was drinking. And Lillian and Ted and his wife Sina remained firm friends forever. So as we know, the Guardian encouraged the believers to try and stay at their posts no matter what. And within the first 6 months, Lillian came across a lot of challenges. She managed to get bitten by a centipede, causing her leg to become large and swollen. And she also ended up in hospital with double pneumonia. Then while she was in hospital, she developed hepatitis and turned bright yellow. Finally, when she was able to leave the hospital, Ted and Sina took her to their plantation to recuperate and showered her with much love and kindness. And while she was there recuperating, someone gave her a local dish, palusami, which many of you might be familiar with. It's a dish made of taro leaves and coconut cream. And this really didn't sit well with her hepatitis situation. Somehow she ended up back in hospital from that. So during these months in Western Samoa, she continued to communicate with Sohail, who she had met in New Zealand at summer school, and they decided to marry in November 1954. As he was in New Zealand and she was in Samoa, and there was only one local assembly in the North and South Pacific. Hawaii was part of America, and this assembly was located in Suva, Fiji. They agreed to marry there. So she caught a ship to Fiji with her bridesmaid, Caroline, who's pictured in the photo. Caroline was a Samoan lady that Lillian had befriended during her time in Samoa. And they got there and Lillian went to the government office and spoke to the Assistant Registrar General, Mr. Edward Woodward, to arrange the marriage. But as neither Lillian nor Sohail were living in Fiji, it seemed like it was going to be impossible for them to get married. However, after she explained a little about the Baha'i faith and marriage laws, and she gave him the consent letters that they had obtained. Now, Sohail's letter from his parents had come all the way from Iran, duly authorized by the NSA of Persia and translated by the British consulate in Tehran. And Lillian's consent letter had come from Australia, authorized by that National Assembly. This government official was astonished by the care and the planning, and he granted them permission to wed under the condition that he could attend the marriage and perform the legal ceremony. So it was the first Baha'i wedding in the South Pacific Islands. Lillian was 25 and Sohail was 27 years old. And several years later, actually, when the National Assembly was formed in Fiji and they applied for the legal registration of the faith, that same Mr. Woodward was still in the office and he granted permission immediately. So following their marriage, they returned to Western Samoa, beginning their life of service together. They lived in an apartment on the top of the bank, and Sohail was the first Persian to live in Samoa, and so naturally people were very interested to see him. And the morning after they arrived, Lillian and Sohail could hear people outside the window, and they poked their heads out and they could see all of the staff from Lillian's company coming to see what Sohail's face looked like. So Sohail obtained work in the same company as Lillian, in charge of the purchase of good quality cocoa and copra, and this enabled him to draw on his agricultural degree. Also, this job was particularly helpful because it allowed Sohail to make friends with farmers from many villages. And later on, when he went to these villages to share about the faith, he wasn't a stranger to the people there. I thought I'd share a little bit about how Lillian and then Sohail went about teaching the faith in Samoa. So during the crusade, as I understand, the Guardian had given instructions to the pioneers as to how they should go about teaching the faith in these countries. And as Lillian described it, basically the pioneers were asked to go to their goal, to make friends with people, to stay there, and to gradually introduce the faith to anyone who showed interest. So before her marriage, Lillian through her colleagues, started to have connections with some of the royal families in Samoa, as many of the girls from these families were working in the same business with Lillian, and they would accompany her everywhere. And of course, teaching first began through example. And Lillian found that in Samoa, people were very kind and caring and were really interested to find out about her life, asking whether she was married, had children, what her religion was. So naturally, she was able to share about the faith. Also, when people invited her, she would join them at church and make friends with people naturally. Also, Lillian said that when she would visit other places around Samoa, she said she would do what all Baha'is did during those days, which would be to walk around and say the greatest name and offer prayers in that place. So after they were married, Lillian and Sohail would also invite people into their home and show hospitality, and they would go to different villages on the weekends. And of course, as time went by, people noticed that Lillian and Sohail were different and that their beliefs were different. And they would ask them what Lillian and Sohail could offer, as of course, a lot of the churches at that time would be offering things to people, like sending their children to schools abroad. And Lillian and Sohail would simply respond saying that they were offering the teachings of God according to what Baha'u'llah revealed, and that these teachings would make everyone better people and enrich their lives. And people really didn't back away from this. However, when people became interested in the faith, oftentimes the churches would then make them deacons of the church or give them another position in the church, which meant that the person had an income. And sometimes people succumbed to this, but of course, many others didn't. I also wanted to acknowledge some of the earliest believers at that time in Samoa. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, Emmanuel Rock was technically the first Baha'i, and he also taught the faith to his wife, Loata Rock. However, both these individuals didn't remain Baha'is throughout their lives. The first indigenous believer to declare and remain firm in the faith his whole life was Mr. Sayalala Tamasese Lealofi, who declared in 1957. Another early believer was Mr. Niuleava Tuatanga, who was training to become a minister, actually, and approached Sohail to ask him questions about this new religion he'd heard of. Another individual who declared in those early years was Mr. Bill Lang, a New Zealander. And although Bill's wife opposed his interest in the faith, he would keep visiting Lillian and Sohail. And eventually, in 1957, the first local spiritual assembly in Samoa, in Apia, was established, which was about 3 years after Lillian arrived in Samoa. So with regard to Baha'i community life and family life, Lillian gave birth to their first son, Badi, in Apia, Western Samoa in 1955. And the following year, their daughter, Sidere, was born in Apia in 1956. They had their third child, Riaz, my father, later in American Samoa in 1960. And in 1955, actually, Sohail's parents, Godseer and Nemat Ala'i, and Sohail's two youngest sisters, Shahnaz and Mahnaz, arrived from Iran to live in Samoa with them. And as Shahnaz and Mahnaz were young children at the time, the family established the first Baha'i children's class in Samoa. And by 1958, they had begun holding summer schools as part of community life. This was also a picture of an intercontinental conference that was held in Sydney in 1958 that they attended. In 1957, American Samoa was opened to the faith. So that happened because Emmanuel Rock obtained a position at the Van Camp Seafood Company, and he and his wife and daughter went to live there. They stayed for about a year, and in 1959, as Western Samoa was progressing well with the faith, Lillian and Sohail and the children moved to American Samoa to keep American Samoa open to the faith. And they both ended up working at the Van Camp Seafood Company as well. In October 1958, Hand of the Cause, Mr. Enoch Alinga visited Western Samoa after his tour of Australia and New Zealand. And I wanted to read a little excerpt from an article from the Canadian Baha'i News at that time about Mr. Alinga's visit, as it gives a little glimpse into what the community was like at that time. So it says, on the day of Mr. Alinga's arrival in Samoa, the friends hired a bus to travel the 22 miles to the airport to welcome him. On the way, stops were made at the different villages to gather those friends that could come. And by the time the airport was reached, about 30 believers eagerly awaited the arrival of their first Hand of the Cause and their first African brother. Mr. Alinga spoke at gatherings in some of the villages, and hundreds of people attended when they heard that someone from Africa had come to Samoa. On Saturday, November 1st, a company of the Apia Friends accompanied Mr. Alinga to a village where the Baha'is had arranged a meeting. He was made a ceremonious welcome in a fale, beautifully decorated for the occasion by the chiefs of the villages, Baha'is and non-Baha'is, and speeches of welcome were made. He gave a short talk in reply on the unity of mankind and religion, and this was followed by the King's Kava ceremony, which is the highest honor that can be offered in Samoan custom. He was then presented with a kava root, and another was presented by the Baha'is to be taken to the Holy Land. And in Samoa, the fales have no fixed walls. So all afternoon, people came by and watched and listened, and many children gathered round as if drawn by a magnet. The Baha'i children presented a beautiful program, and many were moved to tears to hear the gems of Baha'u'llah from their lips. The villagers then served a feast, Samoan style, for all present. And when Mr. Alinga departed, he left behind him an excited throng of people. That evening, many of the friends called to say farewell and to listen to Mr. Alinga's words for the last time. He lovingly presented each Baha'i family with a beautiful picture of Abdul Baha, and there were tears in many eyes. Very early the next morning, he left by car for the airport, but even at that hour, the friends in the villages were gathered at the roadside along his route for one last farewell and the placing of the fragrant flowered leis upon his shoulders. No words can adequately express the spirit of love and harmony that pervaded all those meetings in Samoa. The friends said it was as if the hearts were singing. It was a tremendous experience for the local believers whose horizons had been widened, whose devotion had been deepened, and whose desire to serve the cause had been manifestly increased. Now, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, many other hands of the cause visited Samoa over those years. And you can only imagine how special this flow of love and guidance was to the friends. They were visited by, of course, Enoch Alinga, Collis Featherstone, Rahmatullah Mahaja, John Robarts, William Sears, and Abul Qasim Faizi. And the believers were also blessed to receive Amatul Baha Ruhiyya Khanum twice, in 1979 and 1984. Also during the 80s, Dr. Giaccari visited Samoa a number of times. And as some of you might know, in 1989, while in Samoa, Dr. Giaccari passed away on 5th of July, and he was buried within the temple grounds at the House of Worship. As a result of the progress made in Samoa at Resvan 1959, Samoa became part of the regional assembly that was to be established in the South Pacific. Sohail was elected as a member to this assembly and served on it for a number of years. And as far as we can ascertain, Lillian also served that assembly twice in the 60s. In 1960, when she was visiting her parents at Swiss Cottage, Tamor, her mother, Marie, was feeling ill and unexpectedly passed away. Marie was only 56 years old at that time, and Lillian was 31. And she was also 7 months pregnant at the time with her third child, Riaz. So the 60s in Samoa saw one of maybe the most significant achievements of the faith in recent Baha'i history, but I'll start with some of the smaller victories first, comparatively smaller victories. In 1961, the first local assembly in American Samoa was formed, and Lillian served on that assembly. And actually the last local assembly Lillian served on was in Ili Ili village, which you can see here. In 1962, the island of Sava'i was also open to the faith, which was wonderful. Of course, many other beautiful things happened during this decade, but unfortunately we don't have the time or the verified information to share all of it with you. During this decade, Lillian and Sohail traveled. They were fortunate to attend the Baha'i World Congress in London in 1963. They also had a reunion with Sohail's family there. And in the following year, they were required to move to California in the US from March 1964 to June 1967, so that Sohail could gain further training for his work. During that time, the family lived in Long Beach and then later moved to Lakewood. And in fact, Lillian and Sohail were members of the first local spiritual assembly of Lakewood in 1965. In 68, Lillian had the bounty of attending International Baha'i Convention. And following this, traveled to Iran, where she visited Baha'i holy places and met more of Sohail's relatives. Now on to this incredible moment in the history of the faith in Samoa and also for the Baha'is of the world. The Declaration of His Highness Sosunga Malietoa Tanumafili II, the head or state of Samoa, the king of Samoa. So Malietoa was the only reigning Baha'i monarch to live in modern times to become a Baha'i in 1968, just 5 years into his reign, after he learned about the faith from his brother. In 1967, Dr. Giaccari presented him with Proclamation of Baha'u'llah. And in 1973, the Universal House of Justice publicly announced to the Baha'i world that His Highness Malietoa had declared his belief in Baha'u'llah. And the House of Justice stated that it is now possible to share with you all the news of an event which crowns the victories with which Baha'u'llah has blessed his followers during the 9-year plan, an event of which the true significance will be fully understood only in the course of centuries to come. A reigning monarch has accepted the message of Baha'u'llah. And when Malietoa passed away in 2007 at the age of 95, the House of Justice wrote that his service to the people of Samoa as head of state was distinguished by the high principles, genuine compassion, and personal humility that characterized the constancy of his concern for the welfare of all. As the first reigning sovereign to accept the message of Baha'u'llah, he set a record that will forever illumine the annals of our faith, one that future generations will increasingly extol. So a very significant period of time. This is Lillian at his resting place in 2014. In 1968, there was quite a historic moment when the House of Justice appointed the first continental boards of councillors, and Sohail was appointed to the board for Australasia, along with Howard and Thelma Perks. So the 70s and 80s, over those 2 decades, the faith continued to progress in Samoa with a number of significant achievements. Of course, we can't include them all, but a few of them were that at Resvan 1970, Samoa had its first national convention. And Lillian was elected a member of the National Assembly, serving initially as its chairman. She continued to serve on the National Assembly for the next 19 years, mostly as its treasurer. So that's the first National Assembly there. So in April 1974, the House of Justice called for the construction of a house of worship in what was then Western Samoa. As many of you already know, the Guardian would give the believers property goals. And so Samoa already had land for a temple site. However, the Friends felt that it wasn't really the best, the most ideal land. So they looked at site after site until they came upon a piece of land on which the caretaker's cottage is now located. They were able to purchase this land in 1975, in exchange for another piece of land that the Baha'is owned. And gradually, many individual pieces of adjoining land were purchased by many different people in order to make up what is now the temple grounds. In April 1978, Mr. Hossein Amanat, who's pictured here, who happens to also be Sohail's brother-in-law, he was appointed as the architect of the House of Worship. And of course, many of you might also know that Hossein is also the current architect of the Shrine of Abdu'l-Baha. Almost a year later, in January 1979, Malietoa laid the cornerstone of the House of Worship, and also present at that ceremony was Ruhia Khanum, who had brought a small silver casket holding dust from the Shrine of the Bab on Mount Carmel. In December 1981, the first concrete was poured. And finally, in 1984, the construction of the Mother Temple of the Pacific Islands was completed. And this ceremony was attended by Ruhia Khanum, and of course you can see Malietoa there in this picture, and numerous other guests and dignitaries attended. So during these 20 years, Lillian continued to serve in various ways alongside her service on the National Assembly. She was a representative at the 19th South Pacific Commission Conference in Tahiti. She attended the 1982 Baha'i International Conference in Canberra, where she gave a speech on a tribute to the hands of the cause. And this speech can be found in volume 18 of the Baha'i World. For some 7 years, from 83 to 90, she served on the editorial board for Herald of the South, a magazine that served to share news and connect the believers across the South Pacific. And for over 2 decades, she also served on a national committee responsible for producing monthly TV programs on the faith, as well as devotional programs on radio. So with regard to family life, the 70s saw Lillian and Sohail's 3 children head off to Whangarei in New Zealand to receive their high school education, living in the high school's boarding facilities and being part of the dynamic Whangarei Baha'i community, which had many youth at that time. Their tertiary education was in Hamilton, in Auckland, and they would return home to American Samoa in the summer holidays and participate in summer schools then. Into the 80s, the children spread out into Auckland and Sydney, and eventually Riaz returned to American Samoa to live. And tragically, in July in 1984, Riaz at age 23 was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And for the next 12 years, he bravely fought cancer with a radiant heart, receiving ongoing treatment in Hawaii and then Australia. So the 90s was a period of both joy and sorrow for Lillian. In one way, it was a very special time because by 1990, all 3 of Lillian and Sohail's children had married and the first grandchildren began to be born. Lillian and Sohail were excited, wonderful grandparents to their 6 grandchildren. At that time, Buddy and his wife, Diane, were living in Auckland, New Zealand, and Riaz and his wife, my mum, Kate, were living in American Samoa. And although I wasn't alive at this time, I think it was very special for them. And from what my mum has said, Lillian was a wonderful and doting grandma and a master of mail order shopping, which of course is the equivalent to online shopping nowadays. And she would buy all kinds of things for the new babies that were being born. Additionally, for 15 months between 1990 and 91, Lillian and Sohail resided at Noosa Heads in Queensland, so that Sohail could get his Australian citizenship as Until that time, he had been using his Persian passport, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to renew. In 1992, Kate and Riaz pioneered to the Cook Islands, where they had me, but months after, it became clear that Riaz needed better care and treatment for his cancer that had returned. So they moved to a little town in Queensland, and in 1994, they had their third child, Jessie. Funnily enough, on the same day that Jessie was born, Buddy and Diane also gave birth to their son, Ryan, in New Zealand, giving Lillian and Sohail twin grandsons. In June 1992, Sidere and Ruhi pioneered from Sydney to Indonesia, where Ruhi was from, and they lived in Jakarta. And at that time, they were wisely able to serve a severely restricted Baha'i community, but then joyfully witnessed the ban of the faith lifted in 2000. During this decade, Lillian and Sohail visited their children and grandchildren in Australia and New Zealand, and visits were often made by the family to Samoa, and Lillian and Buddy and Riaz also visited Indonesia. So the 1990s was also a great time of sorrow and loss for the family, as within the span of 11 months between August 1995 and July 1996, Lillian lost both her husband, Sohail, and her youngest son, my dad, Riaz. So while in Tiapapata, Samoa, attending a regular meeting with the National Assembly, Sohail unexpectedly passed away the day after the meeting concluded on the 14th of August, 1995. Now, Lillian wasn't with him at the time, as she was back home in American Samoa, and one can only imagine the devastating shock that this would have been to her, and also to Sohail's mum, who was living with them at the time. And of course, to Sohail's siblings and extended family living in other lands, as well as the Samoan Baha'i community and many other colleagues and friends elsewhere. So on August 21st, Sohail's funeral service was attended by His Highness Malietoa and other government officials, along with Sohail's family and loved ones. He was buried within the Baha'i temple grounds next to Hand of the Cause, Dr. Gia Carey. And you can see their resting places just there. Now, although Lillian was alone in Samoa, she stayed for another 15 years, continuing to work in their company and serve the cause in the beautiful Samoan islands. Less than 1 year later, as I mentioned, on 30th of July 1996, her son Riaz, after years and years of his battle with cancer, succumbed to it and ascended to the Apa kingdom. In the few months and weeks leading up to Riaz's passing, many visitors came from near and far to spend time with him, and Lillian and Sidere and Buddy and their families were ever present in Australia, showering love and support to Riaz and my mum and me and my brothers. And yeah, of course it must have been, I can only imagine, for my grandma, having just lost her husband and now her son, a very difficult time. Finally, though, joy returned again when in September 1998, Lillian was blessed with one more grandchild, Michaela, born to Buddy and Diane in New Zealand. So all through the 90s, Lillian and Sohail, until 1995, continued to serve the cause, while at the same time, of course, tending to their family needs. In the Holy Year in 1992, as you can see here, Lillian and Sohail participated in the commemorative gathering at the Holy Land to mark the 100th anniversary of the ascension of Baha'u'llah. All the Knights of Baha'u'llah were invited to this gathering, as you can see in this photo. And it was here at this gathering that the Roll of Honor, a scroll with all of the names of the Knights of Baha'u'llah, was placed in the threshold of the Shrine of Baha'u'llah. What an honor. In 1996, Lillian was appointed to the Regional Board of Trustees of Baha'u'llah for the Northeast Pacific and served in this capacity until August 2010 before she came to live in Australia. A particularly special moment during this period was also in 2001 with the opening of the terraces of the Shrine of the Bab on Mount Carmel. And this event was attended by 16 representatives from Samoa and American Samoa, including Lillian. So Lillian's final years in Samoa. As you all know, from 1996 and into the 2000s and now, the Baha'is of the world were called to learn about advancing the process of entry by troops, drawing on a particular set of tools, including the core activities fostered by the Institute process. And of course, as Lillian had done during the time of the Guardian, she wholeheartedly embraced the plans of the House of Justice and became an active promoter of the Institute process. She served on the Institute Board of American Samoa and was an active tutor. And in fact, when I came to Samoa in 2010 for a period of service, it was Lillian who tutored me in book 7. And I remembered she was an excellent tutor and had wonderful materials and resources available. And it was just wonderful to do that with her. 2004 was a particularly significant year, as it was the 50th anniversary of the faith in Samoa and the 20th anniversary of the dedication of the House of Worship. These anniversaries were celebrated with an international conference, and the celebrations were attended by His Highness Malietoa as well. And of course, Lillian and her children and grandchildren and various members of Sohail's extended family, as well as many believers from Samoa and around the world attended. And here's a photo of some of the celebrations there. And Lillian at the celebrations with His Highness Malietoa. So in 2006, after being a Baha'i for over 6 decades, Lillian was finally able to attain her heart's desire, the gift of pilgrimage. Although she'd been at the World Centre a number of times before, this was her first and last pilgrimage, and Sidere and Ruhi accompanied her there. Sadly, in 2007, Lillian lost her only sibling, Frank Wyss, when he passed away in Canberra. And this was also the same day that His Highness Malietoa passed away. So due to my grandma's advanced age and increased healthcare needs, on 10th of December 2010, at aged 81, Lillian, accompanied by Sidere, returned to live in Australia. Now, Sidere had relocated from Indonesia to be with her, and Ruhi would travel back and forth as he was still working in Indonesia. So by this time, Lillian had pioneered in the Samoan Islands for nearly 57 years. And when she left, there was a beautiful Baha'i community of several thousand believers. And leading up to her departure, great sadness surrounded Lillian, leaving her much loved Samoan Baha'i community, who farewelled her with love and sadness. And she was assured that they would take the faith forward to even greater victories, of course. On arrival in Australia, much to her surprise and delight, Lillian was welcomed at Brisbane Airport by a group of Samoan Baha'is and former pioneers in Samoa, all now residing in Southeast Queensland. From December 2010 to March 2011, Lillian lived with Sidere in New Farm, a beautiful suburb in Brisbane. And in March 2011, they moved to Gold Coast City in Queensland, where Lillian could see the beautiful Pacific Ocean. Until recent years, she was still serving as a tutor of study circles and participating in deepenings and monthly devotionals in Sidere's home. And she was an active member of the Pacific Group Devotionals Picnics that began in Southeast Queensland after Lillian's 80th birthday. And these gatherings always brought great joy to Lillian. In caring for Lillian and ensuring that she and other elderly Baha'is could remain part of community life in the Gold Coast, Sidere, with 2 other senior Baha'is, formed a team and initiated a monthly seniors morning tea with a speaker, most often one of the seniors themselves. And Lillian attended this every month with the older believers in the Gold Coast. Also in 2014 and 2016, Lillian was able to visit Samoa for a number of weeks, reuniting with the believers there. And until recently, she also continued to visit her family members around Australia and New Zealand. Since February 2018, she's been residing in an aged care residence in a beautiful area of the Gold Coast, close to Sidere and Ruhi's home. And I think she must be probably one of the most visited residents in that facility, with not only Sidere and Ruhi visiting her regularly, but also many other of the local friends and from farther away, constantly coming to pay her a visit or send her flowers, and remembering her and keeping her company. And although dementia has had its effects and Lillian is no longer able to communicate as she did before, I'm continually inspired by her deep attention to prayers being read or sung for her. She sings along as well, and her joyful and reverent spirit at this time. So I wanted to finish by sharing a quotation from The Guardian that I thought was helpful to reflect on. The Guardian said, "If only the Friends could realize it, the glory of our faith is not that people with unique abilities do the work of the cause, but that it is done by the sacrifice of loving and devoted souls who arise selflessly to undertake work they feel themselves incompetent sometimes to achieve. God works through them and endows them with gifts they did not dream they could ever possess." So when I think of my grandma's story, I think about the potential that lies in everyone, every child, every junior youth, every adult, and how we never know what wonderful things that a person might contribute. Of course, when Lillian was a little girl, no one could have known what kind of services she would render to humanity. And I think it's a wonderful reminder to see that potential in people when we cross their paths, whether they're Baha'is or not. So thank you all so much for joining me tonight. And thank you so much to Graham for organizing this. I hope it's been a source of joy and inspiration to you all, as her story has been for me. So maybe if there are any final comments or stories, we can open the space for a few minutes for anyone to share. Thank you.
Haylee, thank you very much for such a moving presentation, such a well prepared and researched presentation. And when we reflect back on Lillian as a young woman, as you presented just an hour and a half ago, and to take us through her life story to see the achievements on the personal side of her family life, in her pioneering life, and in her Baha'i life generally. So it's a very moving presentation, and thank you very, very much. Now, Haylee has opened up an invitation to any further questions or comments. I know we have members of the family online. We'd love to hear from you. And I have one question. What was Lillian's character like? She had a steely determination, and she was, but still also very, very cheerful in the challenges that she faced living in Samoa. Those of you who knew her in those Samoan years may want to share something of her character and some episodes that you remember, because this session is focused on Lillian's life and achievements. Do we have anybody who'd like to share something? And Sidere, please, I think we'd love to hear from you as well. I know Jordan's online as well. I see Kate Ala'i is there. You're welcome to share with us.
Can I just say a couple of words? Thank you so much, Graham, for facilitating the space, and Haylee for that absolutely lovely presentation. I'm very honoured to have been Lillian's daughter-in-law, and her story has constantly inspired me, and I've had tears actually listening to Haylee tell the story that has so inspired me ever since I was privileged to be part of this wonderful family. And she was a wonderful mother-in-law, and very much involved in being a wonderful grandparent as well. But just to see her in Samoa and see how this very shy woman was able to be this hero of the faith, she's just a remarkable inspiration. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate.
Sidere, I think, yeah.
Hi. Graham, I just wanted to say something. Just building on what Kate said, is that I always thought my mother was shy, because I think if you put her next to my father, he was perhaps the more outgoing person. But one of the things Haylee and I discovered in her meticulously recorded albums, about 4 albums from her time in Europe, that she was a very sociable person. And she had lots of friends, and she traveled, and she took photos, and she recorded everything diligently. And this is how we're also able to track a lot of her story. And so, you know, we discover things when we start to address archival records. And yeah, a lot of aspects of her character come to life. And for me particularly, it was her very, very social nature, and also how she was an excellent photographer. Many friends think of my dad as the photographer, and he was an excellent photographer. And we've got about 4 archives boxes of his photos still to scan, but she was also an excellent photographer as well. And I think we also see tremendous loyalty to the institutions of the cause, to Shoghi Effendi, to the plans of the faith, and this idea of this instant and exact obedience and just going. And with a lot of, you know, she was 24 years old and a single woman. And that's very, very difficult in the 1950s to an unknown place. And I think she had tremendous courage. She's a source of inspiration to me for courage and devotion. One of the things I'd also like to say is that even though her body left Samoa in December 2010, she's been in Australia nearly 10 years, her heart has never left Samoa. And that I'm extremely grateful to the Samoan Baha'is who visit her, who come from Samoa to the Gold Coast and come and visit her in our home, and now at her residence. Even though it's difficult for her to communicate now. So it's not only Samoan Baha'is, say in Southeast Queensland, but also who come visiting their family, come from Samoa, and also to the institutions of the faith. The Samoan National Spiritual Assembly has kept in continuous contact with her. I was looking at some photos telling her, writing letters, you know, when, you know, she's in hospital, they hear she's in hospital with pneumonia a couple of years ago, they write her a message, they write her, you know, letters telling them what happened for the 60th anniversary of the faith in Samoa, or the dedication of one of her former homes as a sort of regional center of learning. And on the occasion of, just a personal letter on the occasion of the 60th anniversary, and also to the Institution of the Learned. I was reading just today a very, very beautiful letter from Counselor Kirk Johnson, who travels up to Samoa, and he writes this letter to her the night before her arrival in, the date is the night before her arrival in Samoa 60 years ago. So we're now 60 years forward, and he's imagining what she might have be thinking or feeling that night before she stepped foot on Samoan soil, and also about the youth and what has happened. And so I'm really extremely grateful to the institutions of the cause, to the individual believers, the community, like the Pacifica group, for keeping her connected to Samoa, for giving tremendous joy to her heart in these latter years of her life. And I would encourage those three protagonists to keep doing this for all pioneers in the field, whether homefront pioneers or international pioneers, because it brings so much joy to them and keeps them connected to the faith. And for so many pioneers, wherever they are, they richly deserve it, because they have sacrificed so much of, shall we say, everyday life at home, and built a new life, of course. And it took my mother about a year to decide to leave Samoa. She lived there for 15 years after my father's passing, and she was by herself. She didn't have any children in Samoa or grandchildren. And many thought she would leave Samoa when her husband passed away, Sohail. But she said, Samoa is my home. And so it was extremely difficult for her to leave in December 2010. But she has been blessed to live in a beautiful part of the world in Australia, and to receive so many visitors from the Samoan Islands and elsewhere. And interestingly, I'll just say, quite a number of international pioneers come to visit her, not necessarily from Samoa, but also people who have been in the international pioneering field in different countries of the world. And it's almost like they have a common bond. It's really a joy to experience.
Oh, Sidere, thank you so much. And you've mentioned Councillor Kirk Johnson. He happens to be on. Kirk, I'm not sure, are you in Guam? Could you come online and share your
Sure. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Sitara June. Friends, it's really incredible. I just heard about this gathering this morning when one of the friends in Samoa sent me the link, and I was so honored to have heard this whole story like this that I've always heard bits and pieces. But to have dear Haylee narrate this incredible life for us has been just an incredible bounty. But I was struck at how Lillian's life and example and spirit continues, like Sitara was saying, continues to remain in Samoa. So friends, I didn't know about this meeting today, but I want to read to you 2 paragraphs from a message I sent to the National Assembly last night. I write, these past few weeks, I've been reflecting about the development of the faith in our vast ocean over the past 10 years in particular. And I am struck at the joyous news of a youth being appointed to serve on the Board of Counselors from the Pacific. And I recognize this, as your own chairman did the other night, as an important milestone for both Samoa and the whole of Oceania. Baha'u'llah is about the same age as that first youth who recognized the Blessed Bab on that fateful night in Shiraz, 1844. And the House of Justice reminds us in their Rizwan 2018 message, though separated from our own time by 2 centuries, the society in which the Bab appeared resembles the present day world for the sense of oppression and for the longing of so many to find answers, to slack the soul's thirst to know. Youth were called back then to arise and play their part, to offer their sacrifice, and to lead the charge. And so many did, and so many died. And since those early days of our history, every generation of young people have arisen to the call, including our dear sister Lillian, who arose exactly 50 years after Mullah Hussein, and at the tender age of 24, responded to the call of her beloved guardian and brought the healing message of Baha'u'llah to the shores of Samoa during that world-shaking, world-embracing crusade. And a few years ago, once again, the call was raised to spur on this mighty enterprise. The House of Justice summoned a new generation to take their rightful place at the vanguard of his crusaders. And hundreds of thousands arose across the planet to that summons. And it has been so wonderful, dear friends, to see Samoa once again leading the way. So friends, it's really such an incredible thing to consider how Lillian's example has inspired so many friends over these some 60 years, not only in Samoa, but in Australia and so many parts of the world throughout the Pacific and beyond, that as a young person, able to arise with such distinction, to make her mark, to contribute in her way to the advancement of the cause. And now to see young Bob Ale at the age of just 30 years old, being appointed to the Board of Counselors from Samoa, the youngest of the counselors. It's quite exciting indeed. And thank you for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you very much, Kirk, for being with us and offering those thoughts that you had written just last night that included Lillian's memory. So today we have done our best to remember Lillian's life and achievements, and Haylee has assisted us with Sidire's help in doing this. Haylee, we're going to finish in a moment, but I'd just like to refer back to you and see if there's any final thoughts that you want to give about your grandmother.
Thank you, Graham. I think after what everyone has shared, there's really not much else I can add, except Sidire just commented that today is Lillian and Sohail's 66th wedding anniversary. So that's very special to remember. But really, thanks to everyone for making this such a special evening and for sharing your thoughts and reflections so generously. And yeah, it's really an honor for me to have had the opportunity to share this story. Yeah, so thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Haylee. Thank you everybody for being online. So we'll finish our recording of the session here.